Have you ever wondered, ever wondered?
Dr. Andrew Newberg is listed as one of the 30 most influential neuroscientists alive today. He is currently the research director at the Marcus Institute of Integrative Health at Thomas Jefferson University and Hospital in Philadelphia. He is a professor in the departments of integrative medicine and nutritional sciences and radiology at Thomas Jefferson. He is board certified in internal and nuclear medicine. Dr. Newberg has been particularly involved in the study of mystical and religious experiences, a field referred to as neurotheology. He has published over 250 peer-reviewed articles and chapters on brain function, brain imaging, and the study of religious and mystical experiences. He's also published 15 books, which have been translated into 19 different languages.
So it's such an honor to have you, Dr. Newberg. Your work in neurotheology has been groundbreaking in both theology and neuroscience, and I cannot wait to ask you questions about it.
Well, thank you for having me on the program. Looking forward to it.
Well, let's dive in and talk about define neurotheology for people.
Sure. So neurotheology really is, very simply stated, neurotheology is the field of scholarship, the field of research that looks to try to understand the relationship between the brain and our religious and spiritual selves. Now, so that's the simple definition. Now, for me, for neurotheology to work as a term, there's a couple of important things that I like to say. One is that we have to do a very good job at respecting both sides of neurotheology. And I like to refer to it as a two-way street. And what I mean by that is that it's not just neuroscience looking at religion or theology or the ways that we're spiritual. It's not using theology to try to analyze science, but it's really, both sides of this topic kind of looking at each other to help us to understand who we are as human beings, how we work biologically and how we work spiritually, and how that all kind of fits together and integrates together in terms of who we are as people. So that to me is very important, that both sides are well respected and well developed as part of neurotheology. The other thing that I also feel is very important for people to realize is that both sides, the neuro and the theology side, I think need to be defined very broadly. So neuroscience is neuroscience. It could be neuroimaging, which is a lot of what I do. And I know we'll talk about the brain scans that we do a little bit later on. But it's also how we get at our mind and our brain. It can be through just general health related processes. It could be how our immune system works, how our hormones work. It could be our development, all the different ways that we kind of get at our psychological and neurological part of who we are. So that's the neuro side and using that very broadly. And then theology, of course, is a specific discipline. It's how a given tradition kind of looks at itself, at its sacred texts, and tries to analyze it and help us to figure out how to follow that religion, so to speak. And that's certainly part of neurotheology. We can think about how does our brain wrap itself around topics in the Bible? How does it relate to our behaviors, being charitable, being good, helping others, being compassionate, and things like that. But it also extends far beyond theology. So it has to do with various practices like meditation and prayer. It has to do with the beliefs that people hold, all of the different ways in which we engage our religious and spiritual self. So I think if you define both sides very broadly, then neurotheology also works. And it gives us an opportunity to kind of explore the richness and diversity of how people engage their spiritual selves. And that to me is a very important part of what neurotheology is about.
That's wonderful. To me, it's just fascinating that you combine the two. And one of the things I was fascinated about is how you measure. Tell us a little bit about the methodology. For instance, when you go in to measure how meditation or enlightenment affects the brain, that you actually hook people up to isotopes or the trackers?
Well, I'll start with a quote from my mentor, one of my mentors, about how if you're a good carpenter, you have a lot of tools in your tool basket. So that's very true for neuroscientists as well, and particularly with the study of religious and spiritual phenomena, because they are complex and they're not always so easy to really get at. And so we actually use a lot of different neuroimaging techniques, a lot of different ways of looking at the brain. People certainly have heard of some of them, like like magnetic resonance imaging, MRI. This is basically like a big magnet, and people go into this tube, and you hear all these noises and things like that. That can sometimes work, and we've used that because if you're doing a practice like a very calm meditation where you can lie down and just kind of be still in a scanning environment, that can potentially work, and that can be very useful. You mentioned these isotopes. So my other world of research has been in the field of nuclear medicine, and that is where we administer some kind of radioactive material that follows some part of the body, or in this case, the brain's physiology. And so we can radioactively label some type of molecule like water or like sugar or neurotransmitter like dopamine or something like that. And then we could inject that into somebody and see where it goes in their brain. And we've used that particular technique quite a lot in our studies, because one of the really nice things about that approach typically is that you can inject somebody while they're not in the scanner, so they can be out. And for example, when we've studied people in different meditation practices where maybe they need to be seated upright, maybe they need to be moving their hands. We studied speaking in tongues where the people were dancing around and moving all around. So obviously you can't scan them while they're doing that, because there would be too much motion. But what we do is we put a small intravenous catheter in their arm, and then there's this long line that kind of runs away from them. And then at a particular moment when the person is, deep within their practice, I kind of, slyly, sneak into the room. I'm not really near the person. I'm kind of far away from the person, but I inject the tracer into this line, and then it runs, into their body. They don't feel it. It doesn't cause any physiological effect or anything like that. And then they just kind of keep doing their practice. But while they're doing the practice, this little radioactive material kind of gets into their body and gets up into their brain. And then they finish the practice. When they're done the practice, then we put them into the scanner. But the scanner, when we get the pictures, it tells us where this thing went, where this tracer went while they were doing the practice. So it really captures like a snapshot, if you will, of the brain doing something. And we've used it in many different circumstances, some having nothing to do with religion and spirituality, but I can inject you while you're reading or while you're watching a television program or something like that, and see how your brain is processing, what it's doing when it's processing those kinds of inputs. So it's, I get very excited about I really like your question, because I get very excited about the methodological challenges of neurotheology. And I tell a lot of my colleagues who are even in the more neuroscientific or psychological realms that, that neurotheology really pushes neuroscience forward, because you're talking about trying to find a way of measuring something which is very difficult and very challenging to measure. But it also, if you just think about like the larger medical world, I have no way of knowing if you're, if you or someone is depressed or in pain, or just by looking at you, I have to ask you ultimately, what are you doing? What are you feeling? And that to me is actually another really important part of neurotheology, which is not just doing the imaging, but how do we kind of systematically get at what people are really thinking and feeling in those moments? And again, it's a challenge, but it's certainly something that's doable. And we use that information to try to connect up what the person is actually feeling with what's going on in their brain, and try to see how they all kind of connect to each other.
Which is fascinating to me, because so much of the mystical experience is sort of anecdotal, right?
Right.
But to know that you can actually trace some of these things. For instance, the change that you record in certain parts of the brain, like I was fascinated by the thalamus, it changes, and that's where far in Egypt, in Buddhist and Hindu tradition, it's the pineal gland is there, the seat of the soul. Those things, isn't it amazing to find this stuff out empirically? And then you can go back to these ancient texts And, they talk about spiritual enlightenment begins in the third eye or whatever.
Right.
Do you look at that sort of thing too? With
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, I haven't had an opportunity to do that particular question, but yes, we've talked a lot about how do we kind of correlate what we can look at today with how people have thought about this throughout time, and what are the elements of these experiences, a feeling of energy or a feeling of oneness or a feeling of surrender or something like that. When people talk about that, and these are common terms that are used when people have intense mystical experiences or enlightenment experiences, we can say, okay, well, if we talk about a feeling of oneness, what might that be related to in terms of the brain? Are there areas of our brain that help us in terms of how we feel connected to things, or how we differentiate ourselves with things, and what's changing in those areas? And so, yeah, I mean, it really does try to help us to kind of bring together this sort of ancient wisdom of these traditions with what we now know in modern neuroscience, and try to put all of that information together. But to your point too, part of what to me is so fundamental, I mentioned this really in the first statement when you asked me about what neurotheology is, that spiritual side needs to be very well developed. If I were to do a brain scan of somebody and not ask them about what they felt, what their spiritual beliefs were, whether they felt connected to the universe, to God, what emotions did they have, what thoughts did they, I have to get all of that information, because otherwise I don't really know what's happening. I don't know how to interpret what's happening with the brain scan. So if I can get these detailed descriptions, and we've also done that in some of our research, which is how do we really get at the core of what these experiences are, and that becomes very, very important for us, irrespective of the brain scans. But in fact, one of the things that I often even talk to my religious colleagues about is that part of, to me, what neurotheology is about is not just relying on what the great mystics had to say, but what do regular people have to say? And we did a whole survey where we got like 2,000 people to respond. What did they feel? And I don't want to hear about what Buddha had to say. I don't want to hear what Mother Teresa had to say. But what does the man in the street, the woman in the street have to say about these experiences? And that to me becomes really valuable information, and kind of takes it to a whole other level of what these experiences really do for people, as opposed to just what the great theologians or the great mystics have to say about it. Not that that's not important too.
But what I found just amazing was, even you've done research on enlightenment in an agnostic or even an atheist, and there still is, it doesn't necessarily have to be a religious, in quotes, experience. It is a
Right.
biological experience. Would you call it that, maybe a combination of spirituality and biology? Or
Right. Well, I think there, yes, I think it probably is some degree of a combination of these different aspects. And you bring up actually another really important point about neurotheology. In fact, in a book that I published about 10 years ago called The Principles of Neurotheology, the first chapter is really dedicated to definitions. And definitions are kind of, boring and bland and all that. But for neurotheology, actually, they're pretty interesting, because they also kind of help us in looking at the questions that we're trying to answer. So you mentioned, is it a combination of spirituality and is enlightenment a combination of spirituality and biology? So part of the reply to that is, well, what exactly is spirituality? How do we define what it means to be a spiritual person? And for some people, there's a supernatural element to it, in which case an atheist probably isn't going to feel very comfortable with that. On the other hand, if spirituality has to do with connecting to something greater, feeling a sense of knowledge and wisdom and so forth, well, then yes, I mean, that can be accessible to people who are deeply religious as well as people who are not. And in fact, you use the term enlightenment a couple times. When we published a book, How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain, we realized that there was a very interesting dichotomy. Normally, when we think of enlightenment in a spiritual setting, this is the Buddhas, this is somebody who achieves some kind of spiritual enlightenment. But the enlightenment period in history, which occurred several hundred years ago, was actually about getting away from spirituality and sort of turning towards science and rationality and things like that. So, it is interesting how people can take these ideas and these concepts in lots of different directions. And to me, this is also a very valuable part of what neurotheology does, which is to say, what is enlightenment, the big question, and then, well, what is enlightenment for somebody who is in a monotheistic tradition like Judaism or Christianity? What is enlightenment for somebody who's Buddhist or Hindu? What is enlightenment for somebody who is a scientist or an atheist? And how are they similar and how are they different? And again, that to me is part of asking the questions. What did they feel? What are the similarities across the descriptions of those experiences? But then also, what's the difference, if any, that's going on in the brain? And I expect that when people have similar general components of these experiences. So if an atheist, if a Christian, and if a Hindu all feel a greater connection to the universe or God or something like that, then they're going to probably have similar changes in their brain. On the other hand, if an atheist doesn't really feel that sin is an issue and a Christian does, then the discussion about sin could have very different changes in their brain because of just they're looking at it completely differently. But if they both feel a sense of love or a sense of compassion for humanity, then again, those feelings, if they're shared feelings, will probably have similar kinds of changes in the brain.
Which is also amazing with your work, where you've shown that these changes last. They're not just, short-lived. They will last. They change the person's outlook on life, this oneness. And one of the things that I was really intrigued by, I've done some research on near-death experience and how a lot of the characteristics of people who have a near-death experience, they're changed forever. They don't fear death. They feel a connection. These are things that it seems like in your research, when a person has a large E of experience, enlightenment experience, that these are also characteristics that they adopt into their lives.
Correct. And yes, that to me is always kind of to stick with the concept of enlightenment for a moment. Well, first of all, you mentioned one of the terms that we talk about in our book, How Enlightenment Changes Your Brain, about big E and little e. So the little e experiences are those little moments that, kind of everybody has had a few times in their life, so maybe several times. And then the big E are those kind of life transforming experiences. And as you mentioned, I think one of the things that really is important about those experiences is that transformative element, that it changes them, and it really changes them forever. I mean, it changed it for at least, for their lifetime. And that when we did our survey, we asked people about how did these experiences change, and we asked them about their most intense spiritual experiences. And as you mentioned, they know they fear death much less, maybe not at all. They have a different perspective on their relationships, on their jobs, on their health and well-being, on their sense of meaning and purpose in life. And of course, their spiritual and religious beliefs. And so this really does seem to kind of transform who they are, and does so in a very powerful way. And if you think about it from a neuroscientific perspective, there's an intriguing piece to this, which is that normally the way we think about how the brain changes and transforms is kind of slowly over time. When we learn mathematics, we don't start doing calculus when we're in second grade. We learn addition, then multiplication, then division, then algebra, then, like each piece kind of builds on each other. And then over 20 years or whatever, we become a really good mathematician. And our brain kind of develops over those long periods of time to accommodate those different ideas. But here you have something which literally is moments. I mean, it can be seconds, it could be a couple minutes maybe, and seems to completely reshape how a person is. Now, arguably speaking, it's reshaping their brain as well. And whether or not it does that in a kind of there's a couple of questions about how this happens. And the bottom line is we don't fully know. We don't know if suddenly the brain really does kind of rewire itself and new connections form within seconds and changes the whole way the person is. We don't know if much. I always think of the analogy of like the video games where you like unlock a new character kind of thing when you hit a certain number of points or whatever, whether it was always in us and then suddenly it now kind of unleashes this new perspective on things, or maybe some combination of the two. But clearly it transforms us, and it is it's interesting that those kinds of transformational experiences can come from a lot of different sources. And as to me, this is another important way of thinking about neurotheology. The analogy I use is like a big jigsaw puzzle, that there are lots of pieces to this, meaning that there are lots of different kinds of spiritual or religious phenomena that we can look at. And you can mention near-death experiences, mystical experiences, psychedelic experiences, meditative experiences. Are they similar? Are they different? My tendency to, in terms of my own research, is that we've kind of come to this model of all this kind of large network of brain structures that all can be you can tap into it in a lot of different ways, that ultimately, though, kind of leads to very similar kinds of end results in terms of the experiences. So we do tend to find some core elements of these experiences that seem to have universal characteristics, irrespective of how the person actually got into those states. But again, this is part of what we're trying to look at. Where are the similarities, where are the differences, and then how does that relate to what's going on in the brain?
So I'd like to segue into a topic I'm really intrigued with, and that is where consciousness begins. Is consciousness tied to the physical brain, or is the brain, the physical part of the brain, more of a receiver of consciousness, like a radio or a cell phone, where it's above the brain or wherever, and we're just a conduit for that eternal consciousness?
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that question, but I don't. But but I will say, I mean, again, this is where I think neurotheology has some really interesting opportunities, because mystical experiences, as well as some of the other pieces of that puzzle that we were just talking about, are altered states of consciousness, and or at least generally represent what are called altered states of consciousness. And so, can we use those experiences, both in terms of the experiences themselves, as well as whatever the underlying biology is of those experiences, to try to help us understand this big question about what consciousness is and where that awareness comes from that we have? It raises some fascinating problems for us, because no one has been able to figure out exactly how consciousness connects to the brain itself. We have neurons with a quadrillion different interconnections, and we have neurotransmitters and all kinds of electrical activity and blood flow and metabolism and all the synapses and so forth. Where in all of that are our thoughts? Where in all of that is our consciousness? And you can cut out a part of a person's brain and they still have consciousness. But if you give somebody an anesthetic, then they lose their consciousness. So, we kind of have some ideas about all of this, but we really ultimately don't know. And of course, to me, again, part of why I got into the whole field of neurotheology was that it is particularly in these mystical experiences, these very intense spiritual experiences, that people say a different thing, which is fascinating, which is that they get beyond consciousness, that they get beyond their own ego consciousness, their own ego self, and become connected to a more universal consciousness. Now, I'm not saying that they do, but it is intriguing that this is a description of these experiences. And if so, what exactly does that mean? And how does that help us to understand what science has to say, what psychology has to say, and what the religious and spiritual traditions have to say, as well as philosophical perspectives on this thing that we all seem to have, but no one seems to know how and why we have it, and how to kind of think about it in terms of how to understand what it is. But in my biggest guess at the moment on it, or my best guess, I should say, at the moment, is that I think that it is a little bit of two sides of the same coin, the biological and kind of this consciousness part. That, if you kind of look for the biological, you can find the biological. If you look for this kind of ethereal awareness, you find that. But they may be two ways of kind of looking at the same thing. But whether or not that's actually true or not, we have a lot of work to do as far as where consciousness is in the brain.
One of the phenomenon to me that is it to me sort of it's, and maybe this is anecdotal, but I think we've got proof that it happens in a near-death experience. Many times people will leave the body, but they're able to come back and say things like, I read one anecdotal thing that, well, they said there was a black tennis shoe on the roof of the hospital. Well, if they didn't leave their body and the hospital And then they find the black tennis shoe. And I interviewed Dr. Bruce Grayson some time ago. It's fascinating work.
Sure, I know him well.
Do you? He's a
Yes,
great guy.
totally.
And yeah, and he, you know how he got into the study of near-death experience, where he was a young doctor and he spilled some spaghetti on his tie and then closed his shirt because he did his coat, didn't want anybody to see it. Went in to see a girl who was in a coma and had just been in an accident with his jacket closed. Then went down to the end of the hall to talk to her roommate. Somehow his jacket fell open and his tie was exposed. So the next day, the girl that was in the accident regained consciousness. He went to see her and she said, well, I saw you down at the end of the hall with my roommate and talking to her. And he was totally freaked out about that. And then she said, but there was a spaghetti stain on your tie or whatever. So, because at first he thought, oh, this couldn't possibly be real. So these instances with the near-death experience, I would say verifiable things. Would you say that as a neo-theologian, or however you would term yourself, that those are valid? That's empirical proof or empirical, at least, information?
Well, I mean, it is a very important source of information and data. And I know that there are people like Dr. Grayson and some others who are really trying to do this very systematically instead of just having these, really amazing anecdotes. But yes, I mean, I think that they definitely are important pieces of information, and it is experiences like that that may really open the door for understanding consciousness in a completely different way. I don't know if we're fully there yet, but I've certainly heard of these different kinds of reports, and they are incredibly intriguing. You'd have to figure out what they mean, and you'd have to kind of make some decisions as to, well, what exactly is happening, and is this some kind of sensory processing that we don't know about? Is it possible for a person's consciousness to literally leave their body? Is there a soul? And this gets back to questions about definitions. Do we differentiate a soul from consciousness, from mind, from brain, and how do we think about those things? But I think it's practices like experiences like near-death experiences, mystical experiences, other spontaneous kinds of experiences. We have to look at psychics and we have to look at people who have all different kinds of experiences and do our best to verify them and see if they are verifiable, then what exactly do they mean in terms of how are they working? And because again, there's still a lot of questions that come up about what's happening in the world of neurotheology. Another interesting set of experiments have been intercessory prayer studies where people are like praying for someone to get better. And so first that needs to be verified. There certainly have been studies that have reported positive results. There's others that have reported negative results or non-results. Even if we given that one of these studies might be accurate and really confirmatory that praying for somebody seems to help them at a distance, what exactly is going on? Is it really going up to God and helping the person? Is it something where it is a person's consciousness? What exactly is happening? Is it energy that we just can't tap into? So there are a lot of really fascinating questions that we don't have an answer to yet. And I think the more we can study these different kinds of experiences and look at what's going on in their brain, try to verify them really definitively to be convincing to the larger scientific as well as the general community, the general population, that becomes very, very helpful for us in terms of understanding these incredibly complex and mysterious aspects of who we are as human beings.
Another part of your research I found fascinating was that the parietal lobe quiets when during these enlightenment experiences. That seems to go along with the idea of spiritual awakening, where the sense of self, that's the part of the brain that
Right.
the sense of self is located. So that also goes along with the mystics who say when we awaken, our sense of self, it seems to maybe not evaporate, but
Or go away.
yeah, and we're connected to this oneness. So when you find out these things in your research, I suppose you don't necessarily take that leap into, wow, that is very similar to the mystical experience that's recorded in religious literature, or do you work together with those?
Oh, sure. When we do our studies, and as you mentioned, one of the prominent areas that we've been looking at is the parietal lobe. Again, there's this larger network of structures that we think is involved, but one of the important pieces of these experiences is this parietal lobe that normally takes our sensory information and kind of creates our sense of self and how our self kind of interacts with the world. So it differentiates ourself from everything else in the world. And during these practices where people describe a loss of the sense of self, a sense of oneness, a sense of connectedness, the parietal lobe, as you mentioned, we see decreases on our scans. And to me, that would make sense, at least, physiologically, because if this area normally turns on to give us our sense of self, when it drops away, then we lose that sense of self and we lose that differentiation between self and that other can be other people. So we feel connected to a community. It can be God. It can be the universe, universal consciousness. Again, it depends a little bit on the person's tradition that they're coming from and what their experience is. So that it becomes a very important aspect of these experiences. So now the question is that, does everybody who has that experience, was what was going on in their parietal lobe? And can that help us to understand what these experiences really do for people and how they affect people and how they change people? One of the things that I think is also interesting in this context is that when we think about how the brain is involved with these processes, it kind of goes back to your question about, well, is the brain kind of receiving these things? Is it generating these experiences? And what's happening in this parietal lobe across different kinds of experiences? Mystical experiences through meditation, near-death experiences, psychedelic experiences. And I think the other thing that to me is kind of intriguing is that a lot of times people do appear to, going back to your question right before about the near-death experience, obviously the whole brain is kind of shutting down at that point. And so, does that allow our mind, our consciousness to be able to sort of experience the world in a very different kind of way than when all of the areas of our brain are kind of operating? And it's like if there's a lot of noise in the room, it's hard to hear that person whispering. But if all the noise quiets down, you can hear the person whispering. So and we know that people who at least claim to be able to extend their consciousness in some form or another, they need to get into a trance state. They need to alter their consciousness to get into a state that allows them to have those kinds of experiences and abilities. But again, we still need to ultimately verify whether the experiences and the abilities that people talk about really seem to be happening. And then if so what does that mean? Is it the brain that's sort of receiving them? Is there a consciousness that's receiving them? Really some fascinating issues and challenges for us to figure out.
And the phenomenon of terminal lucidity, have you studied that at all? And maybe this is too anecdotal because you can't really track it scientifically, I would say, but where people who've been in a coma or not cognizant for years, Dr. Grayson talks about many times when right before they actually die, they will become lucid and then they talk to their loved ones and then they're gone. And the University of Virginia, who studies this, it says that, maybe it's that our brain holds on to our body. And then when it starts to disintegrate, the consciousness, eternal consciousness or whatever, can come through for a moment and then it's gone.
It's gone.
What do you think about that?
It's certainly anecdotal, but certainly fascinating. And again, another piece of the puzzle, whether it's people have these different kinds of experiences. Another area which is sort of related to what you're talking about are when people do have injuries to the brain and how does that affect the way in which they think? How does that affect their consciousness? How does it affect their belief systems? Even something like that, as somebody develops Alzheimer's disease, how does their religious or spiritual beliefs change? Part of why I get very excited about neurotheology as a field is that it just seems to be almost endless in terms of what we can start to ask questions about. And they're fascinating questions that really require a great deal of care. And, again, I know people like Dr. Grayson who really have spent a lot of time and effort thinking through how do we look at these experiences? How do we evaluate them? How do we verify them? How do we look at what's going on physiologically? That to me, it really lies at the heart of what neurotheology is about, to try to help us to understand what these experiences are, both from a biological perspective as well as a spiritual one.
all of your books are fabulous. Got them
Thank
all
you.
here. One of the things I loved about how enlightenment changes the brain is you actually take a part of the book and you talk about how we can encourage or speed up the enlightenment experience.
Part of what we've been trying to do to help other people on their own paths is to try to say, okay, well, this is what we have learned from from the neurotheological perspective. This is how neuroscience kind of helps to supplement, augment what we know from a spiritual perspective. And can we use that information as a way of helping people on their own paths? And when it comes to something like enlightenment, there's never a one size fits all, certainly, and there's never I can never say this. If you do this, this, and this, I guarantee you'll be enlightened. But what we can do is look at how, what are the paths that people have taken, what's going on in the brain, and can we help people find a little bit of a way of engaging their own path. And so, for example, some of the things that we talk about in how enlightenment changes your brain is that that most people usually start with the goal of trying to get to, there's a desire to get to this new way of thinking about things. And so that's important that people are, kind of begin their process and begin their procedure. There needs to be a bit of an openness to the process. They need to understand that and prepare themselves for that we don't know what's coming down the road, but we're going to go down that road and see what happens and be open to whatever it is that happens. One of the things that we talk a lot about in our books is the value and the importance of practices and rituals. And again, there isn't a one size fits all, but every tradition has rituals. And this is very powerful. I know we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail in a moment when we talk about sexuality and spirituality. But when we talk about rituals, we're talking about these kind of rhythmic practices that help people to engage their brain, to alter the way their brain works, and to enable them to facilitate these kinds of experiences. And so developing a set of rituals, and people can use rituals that already exist. So you can go down a path of Christian worship or Muslim worship or Buddhist, and there are paths that they have established in the practices and rituals that are part of that. Sometimes it has to do with a person's personal approach that they might want to take. And so again, there isn't a one size fits all, but people need to kind of think about the paths that they take and then ultimately whatever experiences they have to go back and reflect on those experiences and how they ultimately can be incorporated into the behaviors and the thoughts and the beliefs that the person has. So there is a bit of a pathway that can be taken. The exact nature of that pathway is always going to be unique for any given individual. Some might benefit from turning to an existing tradition, especially one that they may come from because they're familiar with it. But a lot of times people have to go on their own paths and go off road, as they say, and find their own path towards the experiences that change who they are.
So I cannot wait for your new book, Sex, God, and the Brain. And so I would love to have you tell us a little bit about it, why you decided to take on that topic and prepare us for that. It's August 6th that it comes out. I've already got it pre-ordered, ready to grab
Thank
it.
you.
So tell us about it and why you took that topic on.
Sure. Well, it is interesting. You're talking about neurotheology, going back about 30 years when I first started to get into this, even before we called it that I was working with a mentor who was by training a psychiatrist, but also an anthropologist. And we talked a lot about the evolutionary basis of human behaviors. And one of his real areas of focus were rituals, as we were just talking about a moment ago, because he noted that humanity is really loaded with rituals. We have rituals in virtually everything that we do. We have religious and spiritual rituals, certainly, but we have waking up rituals and work rituals and sports rituals and educational rituals and so forth. Rituals are these rhythmic pattern behaviors that help us to feel connected to something and kind of get our whole self involved in the process. When you're sitting in a house of worship, it's not just you thinking about the religious tradition or the spiritual tradition, but your whole body and brain and everything is getting involved in it as part of this ritual. So in our conversations about the evolution of rituals in human beings, the natural sort of, if you're going to take an evolutionary perspective, the natural thought process is, well, they must have evolved from animal rituals. But what's particularly intriguing about animal rituals is that all of animal rituals are mating rituals, and they are incredibly complex. They're incredibly, rhythmic and so forth. And what do? Well, they connect the animals to each other, in this case for mating, as opposed to connecting us as human beings to our larger ideas and to our community and to the universe. So from a very early phase, we kind of realized that there had to be this relationship between the mating process, the sexual process, and the religious or spiritual rituals that are all kind of coming from the same basic biological part. What we found ultimately was also very intriguing is that when we, first of all, the description of these experiences have a lot of overlap. So when someone talks about a sexual experience, you feel love and compassion, you feel connected, and you feel ecstasy. You feel this incredible feeling of arousal and energy, but also blissfulness, obviously, as you near the end of a sexual experience. And when we hear about what people talk about in terms of spiritual experiences, we get a lot of very similar kinds of descriptions, the ecstasy, certainly, but that sense of connectedness, that sense of oneness and so forth. So we see, qualitatively, subjectively, there's a lot of overlap in what those experiences are about. So we always sort of had this in our mind, but we never had an opportunity to really make the tie-in together. And that kind of had to wait until a few years ago, where I had an opportunity to do a brain scan study, as I have done on many different kinds of practices, of a kind of, unique practice that uses sexual stimulation as a meditative focus. And when we looked at the brain scan studies of this, we see this interesting hybrid of kind of accessing that larger network that I was talking about through sexual stimulation, but it leads to these changes, as we talked about, in the parietal lobe and some of the other areas of our brain that also are part of the meditative experiences. So we finally are starting to get this empirical data that helps us to see the relationship between sexuality and spirituality. I talk about these experiences, but there's a very rich whole development of what sexuality has led to in terms of humanity. I mean, you think about, for example, here we are in the midst of the political season with all the craziness going on. But a few years back, I had an opportunity to talk about the concept of worship. And we really, as human beings, we tend to worship God. Certainly, we may worship, a superstar or an athlete, a musician. We may worship a political leader or political figure. Well, that grows out of sexuality and mating, because if you look at social hierarchies in animals all the way up to human beings, there was always a queen bee, there was always an alpha male that the rest of the group kind of worships and has to defer to until they get placed by the next thing the next person or being that we're going to worship. And so again, even the idea that within our brains, within our bodies, is this whole concept of hierarchies and worshiping some top individual that plays out. Our morals, look at the 10 Commandments. So much of it actually has to do with not coveting, your neighbor's wife, not committing adultery. There's a lot of sexuality in these in the commandments about how to be moral. So it infiltrates, our entire being, not surprisingly, but no one really had the opportunity to kind of tie all of that together biologically. And that's what I start to do in Sex, God, and the Brain, and really talk about it and try to help us to understand the good side of all of it. And of course, there's the bad side too. I mean, sexuality is a wonderful thing to connect people together in a relationship, but it also can lead to sexual harassment and sexual abuse and violence. And so we really kind of look at all of these different pieces that falls out of our understanding of the relationship between sexuality and spirituality.
That is going to be amazing. I cannot wait, like I said, to get it. I encourage everyone to go out and purchase a copy. And so I'm going to end, Dr. Newberg, with a question about how your research has affected your life. I know you had a enlightenment experience, and that sort of spurred your interest in the combination. You were always interested in all the different religions and how they work together. And so how has this research impacted your life in the last years?
Well, in many ways, this has been kind of the journey of my life. So, going back to when I was a kid, I was intrigued by the fact that there were different religions and different political ideas and different moral ideas. I thought, if we're all looking at the same world, why don't we all have believe the same way? And clearly we don't. and so I started to explore that question about kind of, the big question to me, which was, what is the nature of reality, and how can we know that reality? And to me, the first part of that, at least I started out with thinking, well, it must have something to do with the brain, because it's our brain that helps us to get all this information and to think about things and to use our emotions and so forth, and to try to understand our world. So I studied neuroscience and psychology and all the different ways in which our mind and our brain work. But as I got deeper into that whole analysis and that evaluation, I realized that, things like consciousness and so forth kind of defied science a little bit. And so I thought, well, there are other perspectives here. There's philosophical perspectives and religious and spiritual ones. And so maybe I need to look into that and try to understand how we get to try to answer these questions from those perspectives. And in many ways, a lot of this became really a kind of personal contemplation of these questions. And it became very meditative, very contemplative. As you mentioned, I had certain experiences that I also didn't really fully understand what they were, what they meant. But as I saw descriptions about people having mystical experiences and spiritual experiences, I felt that there were certain elements that I was having to some degree, but trying to understand what they were and what they meant. And so, from all of that, it's really led me down this path of saying, well, both science and the spiritual seem to have a lot to offer, but they also seem to fall a little short. And so maybe this entire kind of combination, I didn't call it neurotheology originally. So for me, it wasn't just science and the spiritual both had a lot to say, but they both seemed to fall a little bit short. Since that time that I started having these approaches and using this kind of contemplative approach, the neurotheology piece really became kind of my journey. It is and I do feel that it is a kind of combination of science, which I love, of this kind of contemplative spiritual part, if you will, where all of that fits together. I don't know, but I keep kind of, it is part of my journey, my search to try to understand myself, try to understand my own personal reflections and experiences, and ultimately trying to understand reality. And I keep working on it. I feel like there's still obviously a ways to go. I haven't gotten to the answer yet. I always tell everyone, if I ever figure it all out, I will be sure to let everyone know. So I don't know if it's changed me so much as it's really become me. I mean, it is kind of who I am, and it to me, it is the most profound of searches, which is to try to understand the nature of the reality around us, and ultimately to try to understand ourselves. And so, sky's the limit in terms of what we still have to ask and what we still have to learn. And everyone can follow the journey. You don't have to be a neuroscience brain scanner person to be able to ask these questions, so that you can kind of explore all of them within yourself and look into things and try to evaluate things and keep asking questions. And that to me is the key to all of it. Try to understand your own beliefs and what you think and where they come from and who you are, and ultimately with the goal of trying to understand the reality around us.
It's beautiful research, because it takes this really heavy scientific data and it makes it accessible for those of us that don't have a background in deep science, neuroscience, or even theology. So it's such important, really fascinating work. And it's just such an honor to have had you here to talk to us about it. So I would love to have you back sometime after things settle down.
Absolutely.
About your new book.
There's always something new to talk about.
Well, you do a great job. And I'm really honored, like I say, to have you, Andrew. And thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on your program.
Thank you for joining me today for my interview with Dr. Andrew Newberg. If you'd like to know more about Andrew's research, visit my website at Have You Ever Wondered Podcast and look under guests.
Have you ever wondered? Ever